Hey, welcome back to Garbardia. I'm Garbro. I have for you finally Chapter 10 of the Veil Riders Book 2. It's taken a while, putting a lot of work into it, more voice actors, blah 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 blah, excuses, whatever. Anyway, be sure to stop. So we have, actually, before you get the fucking affiliates, we actually have a few new voice actors. We have Fire and Maddie who will be joining us on the team, and hopefully they stay. Besides that, we have Redcon 1. So Redcon 1 is for, what the fuck was that? It's just for all your protein, pre-workout, and vitamin needs. If you ever need some kind of protein bar, snack bar, to help curb your cravings for candy and like candy bars, you can get these new soft bake protein bars that are dope as shit. And it just helps keep you healthier, all right? Because sometimes we get snacky. I get snacky. I'm a grazer. I like to go and find some snackiness. No. So these little protein bars help kind of curb my snacking, but also give me the protein and vitamins I need in a day as well. So it's kind of a double whammy. It's kind of nice. Our other affiliate is Skull Splitter Dice. For all your click-clack math rock needs, go ahead and stop by Skull Splitter Dice and find a set you might like for all your tabletop goodie and or wargaming needs. You can buy D6s and fucking just have like 40 metal D6s and just fucking stomp your fucking opponent with them. It's an idea. An idea I've thought about, but you know, whatever. Also, if you need painting supplies for your wargaming or modeling needs, stop by War Games Delivered, our newest affiliate, and get you some stuff you need, whether it's brushes, paints, paint sets, or even just metal mixing balls. They got it all right there for you, so stop on by and see if they have something you need. Besides that, I'm long overdue. I'm fucking late as shit. Let's get this chapter on the road.
War Daddy to Big Queen. How copy?
Captain Faditha scrabbled her hand along the churned dirt that was once her fighting position, attempting to reach the receiver being held up by her radio operator. Inches above their hands, tracers and explosive shrapnel whizzed through the air, sometimes mere centimeters above their knuckles. Once Captain Fadithas got a hold of the receiver, she pulled it towards her face, yelling into it as chaos continued to bloom around her.
I hear you, but now is not a good time!
Yule's voice sounded confused in her ear.
I thought you said they were withdrawing.
Yes, well, they changed their mind. I have to get a handle on this. Can't chat. Out.
Captain Faditha shouted, tossing the receiver back towards her radio operator, the young female southern elf having her head pressed so hard to the dirt that she may have been able to hear its heartbeat. The Stoogs continued their fire, pouring high explosive heat and armor-piercing sabot rounds at any target that presented themselves. Fadithas tried to bring her head up, but had to immediately drag it back down as an answering fin-stabilized sabot round impacted the Stoog 10 yards behind her, the vehicle rocking with the impact, and electrical discharges arcing out into the air in great bolts. As machine gun and rifle fire crackled around her, she saw that only one of the crewmen of the Stoog exited, the Valley Elf's leg missing below the knee, and she screeched as she tumbled over the side, calling out for a medic. Faditha sucked air in and out of her lips before crawling over, grabbing the private who was lugging her radio and dragging them behind her.
On me, Private!
The private sobbed but complied as they both tumbled down into a larger fighting hole, this one connected to the mishmash of shallow trenches. Captain Faditha's crouch ran behind her Queen's 13th and auxiliary complements, and unfortunately had to hop over bodies that had fallen back from the gun line, the forms slumped or simply fallen over into the way. She found the rear exit trench that she was hoping for, and pounded down it at a full run, aiming for a dug-in Stoog called Harming Potion. The Stoog, much like its fellow machines, was thudding away with its cannon and coaxial machine gun, and Fadithas clambered up the back of its casemate in order to get a vantage point on the sudden push that had come her way.
What? Where did all these human machines come from?
The radio operator asked in a hushed voice, and even Captain Fadithas was lost for words as she stared at the entire heavy mechanized infantry company now bearing down on her own.
This doesn't make any sense. These weren't even here but a few minutes ago. There was only chosen children. This doesn't make sense.
She muttered, and winced as the Stug barked out a mithril penetrator, the round arcing through the air in a little blue streak before punching through the center of a Bradley. It must have hit something explosive, as the Bradley trundled forward a few more feet before violently detonating, the turret punching out its time card and landing next to the now burning IFV chassis. Faditha scrambled for binoculars as she saw something amidst the flames and the shadows it casted, and she didn't like it one bit. She pulled them to her eyes and focused in on the infantry squad that exited the Bradley some moments before, and she noticed that the figure leading the group of elves had round ears.
No fucking way.
Fadithus growled and worked the focus on her binoculars back and forth, slowly bringing the man to focus, and she felt the wind leave her lungs as she caught sight of his eyes, his face, and his gear.
Humans! There are humans leading them!
The private next to her whipped her head around to look at her captain, while under them the tank rocked, sending around another pair of vehicles that had come roaring into view, their turrets swinging with lightning speed.
What do you mean, humans? I thought they were on our side.
And they bring the Abram. That's what's been shooting at us.
Fadithus muttered again, and pounded on the turret hatch of the commander position on the Stug. The split hatch opened on one side, and a dwarf popped his head out, wiping beer foam away from his lips. Aye, Captain.
Tell all other vehicles to focus those Abrams. They are advanced human weaponry, and we have humans leading their infantry.
Fadithus said, pointing out the two Abrams who were lacing rounds another friendly Stug. The Stug rocked and reeled from the impacts, but even the advanced human tank rounds had issues penetrating the thick armor of the dwarven mithril weavers reliably. That is not to say the crew was having a good time of it, as she suspected they were holding on to the interior for dear life. I was wondering what those were. Didn't look like any M3 or anything. I'll send word, the dwarf said, before ducking back inside and bringing down his open hatch cover.
Radio.
Fadithus requested shortly, and once the receiver was handed to her, she cast her eyes about the approach to her own flank trench. The Bradleys had halted, laying down smoke and covering fire as infantry made their way up, while the Abrams were attempting to suppress both her own armor and anything brave enough to fire back. She brought the receiver to her face.
All units hold the trench line. Do not push up. We have to regain fire superiority. Humans are leading their infantry. Focus your fire on them as much as you can. We don't need one of them amongst us.
Fadithus brought the receiver down slightly.
Get me Woodwatch.
The private fussed with her radio, twisting the dial until she had the unit Fadithus wanted, then nodded, giving her the go-ahead as she brought up her rifle to start taking pot shots at anything that moved.
Big Queen to Woodwatch. How copy?
Rose nodded to her radio operator, who flicked the frequency to the vehicle's commander line.
Woodwatch.
Do you see the Abrams?
Fadithus asked, and Rose closed an eye, squinting through her detached rifle optic.
2 of them. They'll tear your armor apart if you let them, but they aren't in a cone of fire yet. We're gonna have to wait.
Rose said, and her gunner flexed his fingers eagerly, his own eyes glued to the gunnery sights.
But can you kill it?
Fadithus shouted, and Rose turned her head slowly to look at the dwarf who drove her Stug. The dwarf nodded, but held up 2 fingers. We need the side. He dropped a finger, and we need to be accurate with our penetrators. He dropped the other finger, then turned back around, placing his hands on the driver wheel.
We can. You just need to hold out.
Rose said, then looked to her own radio operator.
Get me the other vehicles.
The Brim Touch nodded, her shoulder horns allowing her to be comfortable in the vehicle, and she clicked a few switches before looking up at Rose. Rose raised her head just enough out of her commander hatch so that the camouflage netting was out of the way of her eyes, and she looked around at the little gang of Hetzers arranged around her. All of their engines, including hers, were off, running off of batteries for the radios and staying as cold as possible. That way thermals wouldn't pick them up. Rose was a human, one of Yule's few humans that prefer to be out of the spotlight and mixed in with the regular auxiliaries. Her close-cut, ruddy brown hair fluttered in the wind as the smell of battle wafted towards her position, a little nook of the woods that was detached from the main line. While the location was dangerous as all hell, as it could easily be enveloped and destroyed, she believed the enemy would not look here as long as they were quiet. She chose the position just in case they need to put holes in the flanks of vehicles, and so far, she believed she had gambled correctly.
All guns take note of the Abrams, ignore the Bradleys. 5, 7, and 10, you take the Abrams nearest, all others take the other one. We have one shot. Do not power on the engines unless you have to. Wait for them to cross your path. Load Sabo, no heat.
Her radio echoed with the acknowledgments of her other vehicles, and the other heavily camouflaged Hetzer's commander hatches opened slightly, and many a head poked out over the rim. She reached out with the toe of her boot and nudged her gunner.
Garrick, I want you to aim for the engine block. Angel, I want you to feed him rounds as fast as possible.
Angel nodded to her, his long valley of ears bound to the side of his head with a strip of cloth.
Yes, Rose.
Rose leaned her chest against the lip of her hatch, eyes watching forward as the battle raged on, and she slowly brought the optic to her eye.
One good shot. All we need.
Get them away from it!
Faditha shouted as she dragged a Southern Elf gunner away from the wreckage of his burning Puma, while other riflemen dragged the rest of the crew clear. The Abrams had punched 4 neat holes into the front armor of the Puma in quick succession, and they were lucky to be alive, let alone in one piece. The infantry fight was ferocious in front of the trench as both sides traded belts of gunfire, and the approaching chosen children had gotten so close that grenades had to be made use of just to keep them at bay. Fadithas heard another cataclysmic concussion as her last line Stu got a direct hit to a critical weak point, allowing a round to sneak in and detonate its ammo. Pieces of armor plating rained down onto the Queen's 13th, many of which couldn't even run because it would expose them to the withering gunfire of their enemy. Harming Potion rumbled backwards out of his dugout and back down the rear slope of their fighting position, removing itself from the view of the enemy. Fadithas couldn't even fault the Dwarven tank commander on it, as what else was he to do when outgunned like this? Captain Fadithas dragged the wounded Puma crewman to the casualty collection area and picked up a spare Dwarven FAL that was laying nearby, jamming a fresh magazine into it as she took position on the line.
They're pushing hard, Captain.
A first lieutenant shouted to her as he hunkered down, pulling the cord on a grenade and flinging it out towards his target. A missile hissed over their heads, fired by the surviving Bradleys in a hope to nab the retreating Stug.
I think they have us here. Their humans are gonna get them by us, I just know it.
Captain Fadithas looked around at the staring faces of her 13th and the auxiliaries, and she formed her mouth into a grim line.
As true as that may be, we have a better human in the woods waiting to take out their tanks. We just have to hold.
Can we?
A female Brim Touch specialist asked, her shoulder bandage and hair plastered with dry blood.
We have no other choice.
Fadithas growled back and began firing her FAL at a group of chosen children who were about to come into the trench, sending Dwarven 762 NATO shredding through their bodies. The gunfire picked up considerably as the outcry from this first charge echoed down the enemy line, and the troopers of the 13th doing their best to dampen the amount of bodies that would be flooding into their position. To Fadithas' horror, not 1, but 3 humans came up and over the lip of her fighting position, bayonets and tomahawks flashing. She didn't even have time to scream as the leading human came at her, tomahawk raised as her own infantry fought hand to hand. She ducked the first swipe, catching a glimpse of the Brim Touch specialist taking another human's tomahawk to the forehead, her body thudding onto its knees before ragdolling down as the axe was ripped from her face.
Son of a bitch!
Fadithas roared, pulling out her own short sword that normally hung around her middle back. The blade glinted as the rest of her company began affixing bayonets or pulling out their own melee weapons, and an Oni staff sergeant had even pulled out a grudge breaker to combat the human charging at him, tomahawk raised. In a mere matter of breaths, 3 humans had taken down almost 10 of her company in their charge, their ferocity only matched by the Oni auxiliaries. Fadithas raised her blade in time to block another arcing strike from the human, the short sword's edge grinding along the wooden haft of the tomahawk before she brought it back up into a guard, lunging forward without even the blink of an eye. The point of her blade was slapped away by the human, cutting his hand deeply, but she checked her shoulder into his rib cage in an attempt to stagger him. Normally, her opponent would have been knocked backwards or off their feet, but the human barely reacted to her weight. She felt his arm wind back, so she shot her legs out from under her, her rump thudding off the ground as the tomahawk whipped over her head, the edge of the axe singing as she rolled backwards back onto her feet, short sword raised. She looked around quickly to take stock and saw that her infantry had taken her words to heart, as now only the Oni and she were dueling living humans, the other now being stabbed to death by gangs of southern elves, brim-touched, and dwarves. Even despite their short appearance, the position was already thick with the dead, brought low by tomahawks and bayonet. Captain Fadithus leaned to the right and then back as the human male came at her again, roaring as he swiped with his tomahawk. She saw him shifting his weight around in another strike and held up her free arm, catching his forearm on hers while she had already brought her blade back for a stab. She was stopped by a sudden headbutt from the human, her brain buzzing from the impact as she stumbled backwards. Her blade stopped mere inches from its point punching through his skin. The human bellowed and brought his axe up, and Fadithus barely sidestepped out of the way, her vision swimming. Fadithus gasped, breathing out harshly as she held her head and tried to fend off the human as other members of the Chosen Children poured into her company, the fighting fierce around her. The Oni howled as he brought his fist crashing against his own opponent's face, knocking the human to the ground with a splatter of teeth and blood. The human had only a moment to lift his head before the grudge breaker came down onto his spine, shattering it and snuffing the life out of him instantly. The Oni went to move away, but had heard stories of humans and their abilities to shrug off horrendous wounds. So he brought the grudge breaker down onto the human's head instead, scattering brain and skull in a plume. Fadithus staggered backwards further as she parried another strike, bumping into one of her southern elves who was spitting curses at a Chosen Children southern elf as they both attempted to strangle each other. She ducked, her hair braid whipping around as the tomahawk flew over her head, and she launched off her front foot, thrusting into the human with her short sword. This time the blade made contact, but not before Fadithus caught the human's large fist to her cheek. Both of them spun away, Fadithus coughing and spitting out blood as the human held his buzzing hand to his stomach, blood blossoming out along his uniform top. "Ah, you've killed me," the human said, and Fadithus shuddered at how much it sounded like Yule. She stood up straight, short sword poised as she watched him. The human kept his hand held to his stomach. "That was a good blow. You're tough for an elf, I'll give you that. You have probably a few minutes before I'm dead. Think you can last that long?" Fadithus brought her sword back into a mid-shoulder guard, her other hand brought back towards her at a high ready. A chosen child was sent screeching through the air behind her by the Oni catching them with his grudge breaker, and they crashed onto the ground in a heap.
Come and see, scum,
she growled, blood trickling down her chin from her busted lip. Rose's eye reflected the scene coming through her detached optic. Fadithus whirling in melee combat with a human almost 2 feet taller than her, while other such battles raged along the trench. She breathed calmly in and out through her nose as she tracked her optic back towards the Abrams, who were idling only 20 yards away from her kill radius. She knew they were waiting for the infantry to mop up, and would only push up if their guns were needed to clear out the remaining forces in the trench.
What are they waiting for?
Her radio operator asked, the female brim touched nervously tapping her fingers on her radio shelf.
They're waiting to see if they need to shoot anything.
Rose replied, her toe tapping once per 5 seconds on the back of her gunner's seat.
We don't fight infantry with tanks. Good way to die. We use IFVs for that. Watch.
Rose nodded towards the Bradleys, which were now slowly crawling forward and opening up with their autocannons at any target that was safe to shoot at.
They're going to walk those things forward to take care of any infantry. The Abrams know their targets.
As Rose said this, she noticed the turrets of the Abrams twitch to the left, and she followed their barrels. The last remaining Stug harming potion had repositioned itself further down the long hill the Queen's 13th had set up on, and opened up with its gun, sending a heat round splashing into the farthest Abram's side. The reactive armor detonated and nullified the majority of the Stug's fire, but both of the Abrams reacted to the Stug, sending their own responding rounds in kind. These struck home harshly, the Sabo rounds causing great arcs of lightning to crack out from the Stug's mithril netting armor, and the Stug began to slowly trundle backwards like an injured wolf.
You absolute mad bastard. Are you for real? That's not gonna work.
Rose whispered, watching the Abrams intently. She blew out a breath as both of the Abrams shot forward, recognizing the Stug was the last of the enemy armor, and made to take chase.
Son of a bitch!
Rose shouted, then leaned over the side of her heavily camouflaged Stug.
Guns ready!
Guns hot!
A chorus of voices shouted back as all of Hetzer's engines purred to life with the Stugs. Rose bent down to the brim-touched male in the gun.
Garrick?
This time, both of his eyes were open, one tracking the actual gun sight while the other tracked the Abrams' movement on the edge of his vision through a periscope.
I have them.
He mused, hands white-knuckled on his firing mechanism. As the vehicles rumbled to life, Rose keyed her radio back on, clutching the receivers to her throat.
Do not fire until all guns are on target. Call out when you have crosshairs on armor.
Again, her ears filled with the replies, and she waited. The Abrams were quick over the rough ground, the large engines keening as they fired even on the move, adamant on removing this last contester to their domination. Rose narrowed her eyes as the first call came from a nearby Hetzer, and she could see the barrel slowly tracking on the corner of her vision.
7 on target.
2 has eyes.
10 watching.
Rose stayed patient, her foot now tapping rapidly on the seat of her gunner, and she heard the dwarf lean forward as Garrick avoided her foot. Once the last Hetzer called out they had a target in their sights, she gave Garrick a whack with the side of her foot, and he grinned fangedly as he closed his unneeded eye. He breathed out in a hushed voice, finger pulling back on the firing mechanism as he tracked the engine compartment of the Abrams along his triangular panzer side.
Finally.
The thunderous booms of Woodwatch opening up with their ambush vehicles caused the humans to stumble in surprise, looking up in astonishment as both of the Abrams were struck in the flanks, one of which exploded almost immediately, the turret bursting with flames as the crew was cooked alive inside or zapped by the detonating mithril Sabo penetrator. This was enough of an opening for the now heavily bleeding Fedithis, who screeched in rage as she lunged forward for the final time, burrowing her short sword up to the hilt in the human's chest. He had gotten in 2 good strikes on Fedithis, causing her to bleed heavily from her shoulder and chest, and this was the opening she truly needed. The human came down onto his knee, breathing in wheezing breaths before looking up and smiling at Fedithis, his head nodding in an appreciative manner. "Sneaky, sis. Real sneaky," he mumbled, blood streaming down his lips as he came down onto his other knee and then down onto his side, tomahawk clinking away from his hand as it tumbled to the ground. Captain Fedithis heaved in lungfuls of air as she stood, turning to look over the remnants of her ruined formations as Woodwatch continued to fire. The rest of the Bradleys, who had been pushing up towards the trench, quickly crumpled under the fire of the Hetzers and Stug, while Harming Potion limped out to put the final round into the last Bradley. The crew from the engine-stricken Abrams attempted to bail from their tank, but Harming Potion had an axe to grind as they shifted on their tracks, hosing down the crew with his coaxial machine gun as they attempted to escape from its hatches. With their armor destroyed, the Chosen Children and their human allies began to draw back in full retreat, taking advantage of the smoke that wafted from burning vehicles to slip away without any further mass casualties. The odd, unlucky bastard copped around on their way out, falling down to the grass in a heap. Captain Fedithis winced and came down to her own knee, looking around at the face of the human she had slain, then over to the dead body of the specialist who had caught a tomahawk to the skull. Blood was pouring out of multiple wounds on her body, the worst being a deep laceration on her shoulder, and soon she was swarmed with medics. She sighed as her officers began to pour in to report, spilling information in a torrent. She chugged one of the few precious potions of greater healing as her wounds were bound in order to quicken her ability to gain a second wind. When she had the strength, she stood. Calling out into the air, she cradled her heavily wounded arm with her other hand.
Queen's 13th?
She yelled, and she was met with the resounding roar of the survivors of her company and their auxiliaries. She turned.
Colors!
Callers!
Cried out a female Southern Elf private, and the battle banner of the Queen's 13th was raised up and planted into the dirt, the banner having fallen due to the blast of a tow missile. Another roar echoed out along the defensive position, and Fadithus turned around to see that Woodwatch was making its way out of their position in the woods. The ambushed tanks wormed their way through the burning enemy vehicles, making their way towards the defensive line. Rose was sitting gamely atop her camouflage-netted stoog as the Hetzers zoomed past her. Yethus grimly understood that these vehicles and the wounded harming potion were the only ones she had left, as the rest of the Pumas and Stoogs were either burning or so damaged they were inoperable. She did still have a few dingoes and motorcycles left, but they would not be much but flies when compared to Bradley's and Abraham's tanks.
The Abrams.
Fadithus muttered, and she limped over to the edge of her defensive line before stumbling down the other side, making her way towards the stricken tanks. A few times she stumbled over bodies laying still in the grass, and another thought occurred to her as she turned to one of the soldiers that had followed her over.
Sergeant, create a party and get them gathering weapons and ammo. You never know when we might run dry. Also, look for survivors.
The Southern Elf said briskly, saluting her before running back towards the smoking and crater-marked defensive line. Fadithus turned back to the two Abrams, one burning ferociously while the other was still littered with the remnants of his crew. Some of her Queen's 13th and Coswling Company auxiliaries had walked up beside her, and the large Oni that had killed a human with his grudge breaker whistled, the large hammer-like weapon resting on his shoulder. Fadithus noted with disgust that there was both blood, brain, and hair stuck to its metal studs, and she grimaced.
Yule is not going to like this.
The Oni said with a frown as he reached out and lifted the head of the driver, who had gotten ventilated while attempting to exit their hatch. Fadithus stared with slitted eyes as the face of the human driver came into view, an older-looking man who may have been in his 30s.
Ewell is going to have more problems than this if it tells true. I thought the veil was damaged. How are they getting advanced armor like this through?
Don't know, boss.
The Oni replied, letting go of the slain human's head. It thunked lifelessly down onto the armored deck, and another voice piped up from the group behind them.
Why didn't they drive away?
Asked a female Yamato medic who was checking over the group of dead around her feet. No engine. Rose must have targeted it first, a dwarf engineer answered, pointing out the large entry hole where the mithril penetrator had slipped past the weaker flank armor into the block of the engine compartment. They were dead in the water. Must have thought they could make a run for it.
But I thought the humans were on our side. Captain?
Asked a female specialist from the 13th, and she walked up beside Fadithus, hands clasped together near her chest.
Did you forget who trained us?
Fadithus muttered back, her eyes looking up to trace the form of what must have been the gunner, his body laying sprawled over the turret and blood trickling down the side of the turret plate in rivers.
I know, but they weren't exactly happy about it. Some of the humans were even chained to their tables, remember?
The specialist whispered over the crackling of the burning Bradleys and Abrams.
I never thought they would actually be used in the fighting, remember? They told us not to trust humans, even the ones in the training grounds were supposed to be viewed as inferior and dangerous.
They were definitely dangerous,
said the Oni, thudding his grudge breaker onto the ground.
Only a handful managed to tear apart nearly 20 of us. One even got close to snuffing out your captain.
Staff Sergeant Bando, don't be so dramatic. He wasn't going to snuff me out.
Fadithus muttered, even though she winced and cradled her arm tighter to her chest. The small group stood there, staring at the Abrams whose armor was littered with the bodies of its human crew for a long moment. No one said a word as they all took in what this meant. More humans may be on this side of the veil now, one way or another, and they were not as friendly as Yule's company. The specialist, however, was the one to break the silence as she walked towards the tank, reaching out with a trembling hand to lightly place her fingertips near the dead human driver.
What does this mean now? I know we broke away and all that, but do we attempt to keep the humans alive?
She looked back towards Fadithus, who was staring intently at the tank, her face grim.
If they stand with us, they are friends. Otherwise, they will meet us on the other end of our rifles.
Fadithus said flatly and turned, raising her good hand.
Someone get me a tally!
As her captain and the rest of the troopers filed the way after her, the specialist brought her outstretched hand back up towards her lips, and she chewed on the inside of her bottom lip as she mulled over the thoughts in her head. The clouds of smoke drifting past in the soft afternoon wind, rolling over the grass, the fallen bodies of her fellow southern elves, and across the tank she stood in front of. She turned, casting her eyes over the broken, shattered or burning Bradleys, the infantry squads laying dead around them or gone in the retreat, and she sighed, reaching up to brush her hair back before making her way towards the defensive line. When she was past the main lip, she heard Captain Fadithus speaking into her radio receiver as a radio operator cleaned blood off her bayonet.
Yes, we took heavy losses. We can't hold this position any longer and need to fall back to Point Charlie.
Her ears perked up to the voice of Yule on the other side, her ears still keen thanks to her habit of stuffing cotton wads into them whenever she could before the gunfire began. She ambled over, idling near the rear of Fadithus.
All the way to Charlie. Must have been one hell of a mess. I don't like that they had all that armor with them, or the fact only 2 Stoogs survived the encounter. I remember you having well over 10.
Captain Fadithus hung her head as said burning and damaged Stoogs were still within eyeshot, and she glowered at them.
They were doing fine until the Abrams showed up. I still have 2 Stoogs and the rest of the Hetzers, though, and there's a tree line to the south I can tuck them into.
Do what you have to, Captain. I have a feeling things are not going to get any better here. Pull your company back to Point Charlie and dig in. You can't go any further back, I'm afraid.
I know. Out.
Fadithus said unhappily, closing her eyes as she held the receiver back to her radio operator. She blew a breath out of her cheeks before standing up.
Lieutenant Obran!
Lieutenant Obran jogged over, his M4 rattling on his back.
Ma'am?
Captain Fadithus looked around at her ruined defensive line, the wounded and the stacks of the dead.
We're falling back to Point Charlie. Get everyone moved out. We'll bury the dead when we arrive.
Right away, ma'am.
He answered with a salute, then sprinted off, shouting orders as he did. Captain Fadithus saw a Stoog parked nearby with the name Margaritaville and knew it was Rose's, and she walked over as her company began to scramble along behind her. She clambered up atop the rear engine compartment, using the outcroppings for tie-downs as steps. When she was near the top of the Stoog, she knocked on the commander's hatch.
Rose?
A creak came from inside of the Stoog and the hatch slowly opened, Rose shoving it back onto the top of the armor plate. Rose puffed out a breath from the weight of the hatch and then leaned onto her elbows while cracking her knuckles.
What's up, pointy ears?
We're falling back to Point Charlie.
Fadithus said, a little annoyed that Rose refused to use her name, let alone her rank.
All the way to Charlie? How grim.
Rose murmured, then reached down to pluck up a hand-drawn map she had bought from a merchant.
Looks like there's a wood line to the south. But this kind of trick only works once. Still, worth a shot. We'd be no good in the open if more actual armor comes at us. We'll set up here.
Rose said, tapping her finger on the map near the Point Charlie defensive position.
Do I get to say in this?
Fadithus asked, but she already knew the coming answer.
Nope.
Rose said with a smile, and her cheek caused Fadithus to smile angrily.
We'll meet you there. Go ahead of us.
Fadithus said, and Rose winked at her happily before dropping back down inside the fighting compartment. Captain Fadithus ran her hands down her face, dragging the tips of her fingers along her flesh as she grumbled in her throat. The retreat to Point Charlie went without harassment despite the slapdash nature of it, as those who couldn't catch a ride had to trudge along in the tall grass. The defensive fortifications at Point Charlie included a dugout command bunker, the earth moved around and dug away by engineers and spellcasters that specialized in druidic tastes. She sat now in said bunker, a pile of handwritten and hasty reports laying at her feet and beside the legs of a squat little chair she had found inside. According to the remaining platoons, she had taken almost 40% casualties during that singular defensive gesture, many of which were killed in action and never to return to fighting strength. In addition to that, the group of armored vehicles that had been stationed with her was reduced down to 2 Stugs and 6 Hetzers, with half of said lost Stug crews being lost in action as well. A few scout engineers from the Dwarven clans had already scoured over the wrecks of their tanks and made notes to send back to their holds. While the Stugs could handle abuse from Bradleys and missiles, the Abrams were able to pound their Sabo rounds in close enough succession that they bore a hole right past the mithril webbing, almost always killing the entire crew with the shrapnel. In the distance, even from her earthen bunker, she could hear fighting along the main line of the city, and she for the first time in months felt the dread of defeat washing over her. Her wounds were halfway healed, making her muscles stiff, and her joints popped and tinked whenever she moved too quickly. The silver lining to this retreat was that she was now within solid range of mortar support. More good news was that a smaller dwarven hold had figured out how to reproduce the M119, as wreckage of the type was found around the ruined Vale base. 3 of these were now at the battery within Tallwheat, but their ammunition was scarce due to production issues of the casings. Fadithus' radio operator sat nearby, changing out the battery packet on her radio with thick leather gloves to avoid burning her hands. Once she had the radio back up and running, she began tuning through the channels to pick up information. Fadithus waited patiently, idly picking at the dry blood on her chin. The radio operator held her single earpiece close to her head as she shuffled through the channels, and after a time looked up to her captain.
We are getting reinforced with auxiliaries. There is no more armor to spare, but for a few turreted pumas and a handful of half-tracks.
Captain Fadithus breathed in slowly through her nose before she answered.
Better than nothing, I suppose.
A figure entered the doorway to the bunker and the 2 southern elves looked up, their eyes as tired as their bones. Standing there was a brim-touched, his uniform clean but still bearing wear marks of the main front.
Captain Fadithus?
That's me.
Fadithus answered, running her hands up the thighs of her trousers before standing up, wincing as she did.
Sergeant War. We're your relief. They're cycling fresh reinforcements to the front, and we've been tasked to reinforce you.
Reinforcements?
Fadithus asked, and she sniffed at the air slightly, noticing there was a lovely smell coming in through the doorway. War nodded.
About half a company came in with some supplies last night. They're extremely green, but bodies are bodies.
The brim-touch unshouldered his rucksack and pulled out a pair of olive drab green field ration soup canisters.
We also brought you guys some hot food and bread. It's not much, but it tastes good at least.
Fadithus felt the strings of her soldier heart tug as War pulled out 2 large loaves of homestead bread as well. Homestead bread was generally baked in large rounds using good wheat and a lot of elbow grease, and the smell alone could send the dead peacefully to their graves. War handed a loaf to her as well as one of the soup canteens, then gave the southern elf captain a pat on her non-wounded shoulder.
I heard you guys had it pretty rough at Point Alpha.
We did, yes.
Fadithus answered, slowly unfastening the torsion clamps that held the canister's lid in place.
How about you?
Sergeant War shrugged, pulling over another small chair from the group that was stacked in the corner.
It's been rough. Ammo was damn near depleted, and the reinforcements only brought a trickle of the river we needed. They got into the trench twice, and Eul's been talking about pulling back into the city.
Into the city? Isn't that a bit dire, though?
Fadithus asked, the lid coming away with a light rattle before the comforting scents of cream and vegetables wafted up to her nose.
Not like we really have a choice. You got caught with heavy armor in the flank, we're damn near black on ammunition at the front, and the trench is so full of dead bodies it may as well be a mass grave at this point. You should see the open ground from the trench to the portal. You can barely even see the grass now.
War said, shaking his head as he opened up his own soup canister.
We don't know how much longer we can effectively hold the front line. They're drowning us in bodies and are slowly picking away at us piece by piece. We haven't lost too many, but it's enough to affect Eul's front line. The buildings are getting hit more too, and yesterday they started shoving the cheaper armor at us, armored cars and the like.
Fadithus didn't speak for a moment, taking the time to rip off chunks of bread and dip it into her soup. Her radio operator was already almost halfway through her own canister, only stopping to use a spoon to avoid Fadithus chucking a rock at her for acting uncivilized. She popped a few of the soup-laden bread pieces into her mouth, looking down at her boots as she chewed, then turned to War.
Do you think they applied so much armor in hope of breaking through?
Sergeant War looked back at her, chewing on his own bread as he thought. He swallowed, then leaned back in his chair.
Makes sense, doesn't it? Most of the extra armor is on the other flank, since it's a nice flat plain. If they had broken through,
They would have rolled right up into the city, said another voice, and through the doorway stepped Gruesome, the human sergeant major of the medical wing. Behind him stepped Medical Staff Sergeant Salili, the brush-feathered harpy, looking exhausted. You'll ask me to look you over. Said you had a duel with another human. At these words, War looked alarmed and snapped his head from Gruesome to Fadithus.
wait, you had to fight a human?
Fadithus swallowed nervously as a large frame of Gruesome stepped towards her, pulling out small bottles of tinctures from his pack. Salili unshouldered her sling pack and walked over towards the radio operator, noting that the southern elf had a cut on her cheek.
I'm fine.
The radio operator said, but Salili shook her head.
Wound smells. Let me apply tincture.
And you can tell me about the human, Gruesome said quietly, and motioned at Fadithus' uniform top. Take that off, it's covered in blood anyway. Fadithus hissed as she rolled her shoulders, removing the heavily stained uniform top and tossing it to the ground, exposing her numerous slashes as well as the 2 deep wounds on her shoulder and chest. Gruesome washed his hands with the clear liquid before probing the wounds with his fingers, feeling around them for broken bones. What did he sound like? He asked after a moment, while in the background Salili began sewing the cut on the radio operator's cheek.
Like you.
Fadithus hissed, closing her eyes to the pain. Unsettling, Gruesome murmured, pulling out one of the small bottles and a pinch of cotton fluff. Did they say anything?
Nothing that would be of use. They were leading Chosen Children ground troops, and at least one of their Abram tanks was entirely human crewed.
Fadithus said, leaning down to the side to pick back up the soup canister she had set down in order to take off her uniform top. You'll think they are being press-ganged or blackmailed in the service, Gruesome replied, applying the tincture to the larger cuts in order to numb them. He isn't... well, we aren't too confident people who sound like us would work under the Fae, and we believe there must be something else at work here. We haven't had much news of the home world, and it's a shame you couldn't take any living humans as prisoners. Fadithus chuckled, sighing as the tincture took away a little measure of the pain.
They didn't exactly make it an option. The one who dueled me to the death wasn't inclined on being taken prisoner, and the ones who were living made their way through the smoke to safety.
Looks like he almost made it an even trade. He got you good on a few of these, Gruesome said with a furrowed, methodical brow as he brought out his needle and thread, and was quickly stitching along the larger wound in her shoulder. Fadithus nodded her head slightly in agreement, taking a small pull from the soup canister and supping at the broth before pulling it away.
I think I only survived because he got surprised by Rose's tank ambush. Gave me a moment to slip in and finish the job.
With what? That? Gruesome asked, nodding towards the short sword near the small of her back as another figure passed through the bunker doorway.
And I did a beautiful job if I may toot my own horn.
Rose said with a flourish, pulling a bottle out of her own satchel bag and pulling the cork out with a crisp pop. Hello, Rose, Gruesome said in a strained voice of politeness, tying off the end of his first stitch as Fadithus gave a small wave.
Rose.
Salili said quietly, and the radio operator gave her a curious look as the harpy was finishing her own stitching, having to go a little slower due to her wing claws.
If it isn't a dour wall of muscle in his lovebird.
Rose said happily, kicking the ground with her heels as she walked forward and drank from the bottle. Gruesome rolled his eyes to Fadithus as Salili made mock stabbing motions with her needle, whispering angrily to the southern elf radio operator all the while. Rose pulled the bottle from her lips and swallowed before putting the cork back into the neck.
Yeah, anywho, Wood Watch is all set up again. We have nice clear lanes of fire across the entire grassland towards Point Charlie. Can even see our old tank still smoking in the distance.
Still tucked away in Margaritaville? Gruesome asked, now sewing up the large laceration on Fadithus' chest.
Yeah, Stug is still chugging. Probably wouldn't be if we were on the gun line. Really hope the doors can get us some turreted armor here soon.
Rose mused, leaning over and snatching a pinch of Sergeant War's bread. War just exhaled out his nose in amusement and broke her off a larger chunk.
Don't get your hopes up. They're having trouble getting the hydraulics working for the larger vehicles. Best they can get is the turreted Pumas, and those are mostly hand crank anyway, since the lines keep developing holes.
Oh, how I do miss the simple salvation of a good rubber.
Rose said in a mock sigh, then took the hunk of bread with a cheeky smile. Rose did not spend any more time than she needed in the company of Gruesome and Salili, saying her goodbye and heading out back towards her armored ambush platoon. Salili, for the most part, seemed happy to see her go, and even more happy when Gruesome finished up his work on Fadithus. He gave Fadithus some request to go easy on her shoulder before making his own way out of the bunker, but not before scooping up Salili into his arms and giving her a little kiss on the cheek as they went. Sergeant War was the next to go, having finished his soup and then returning to his own platoon to make sure they had settled into their new position. Captain Fadithus was left alone with the radio operator, the two eating silently as the sun dipped down to the last dregs of dusk. Darkness soon overtook the Point Charlie defensive line, and all was quiet. It appeared both sides had their fill of death for the day, and she hoped it would last for a little while longer. With her soup can empty, both she and her radio operator left the bunker and deposited the empty canisters with the field kitchen the relief had brought with them. Fadithus found her baggage stacked neatly near a new command half-track and pulled out her other field uniform, buttoning it up in the light of the half-track with a few hisses of pain as her shoulder complained.
Should I set up in here, madam?
Go ahead, Rafa.
Fadithus said, and her radio operator happily opened the back doors and hopped into the half-track. As she was rolling up her cuffs, another lieutenant walked past the headlights into view, saluting tiredly and not even waiting for a return gesture.
Ma'am, we're all set up. Healers were able to get a lot of the wounded back up and running, but I'm afraid the 13th is still only at 73% strength. Locals helped us bury.
Fadithus shook her head softly.
Such as it is. Such as it is.
At this rate, we'll be an extinct faction of Southern Elves. Wouldn't that be something?
He said with a wry smile, hooking his thumbs into his pockets. Fadithus chuckled dourly, finishing off her cuff sleeves.
Oh, come now, Lieutenant. I'm sure we can't be the only ones.
And that's the end of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 coming up very soon behind it. I have the voice actors already having their lines already coming in. So hopefully Chapter 11 will be done next week as well. And then an additional chapter of the Veil Riders thanks to a very persistent fan who has a gigantic fucking wallet, apparently. Anyway, hope you enjoy the story. If you like the story and others like it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbeardia. And find me on Twitch at Garbro or Garbeardia. I think it's Garbeardia actually on Twitch. And yeah, if you really like the story and have ad blocker and don't want to deal with YouTube, I do have a Ko-fi link where you can donate money to me and the voice actors. Now, if you have a voice actor in mind you like the most and you want to donate to them specifically, you go to the Ko-fi, put in your donation. I am fucking trash. Put in your donation and then their name and say this is only for so and so, and only they will get that money. I will take no cut. That is how I operate. But anyway, that was Dusty Parchment and or the Beldam, our senior VA. That was Eliza. That was Fire. That was Aristic. And that was Rye, our guest VA. This has been Garbro, and This mess of people is Garbeardia, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I'll see y'all next time on this side of the veil.